and see if it works this time, kind of thing, you know? No.
I think
Well,
it's
that could be
reasonable to
passed to the drivers, right? By the Cinder code. We calculate it and we pass it to the drivers, so they don't have to figure out, and we don't have 20 different bugs in 20 different drivers because each one has added a different number, right? But I
Okay.
think what you said, Walter, is probably the best approach to fix this without going crazy and the double accounting and everything. Yes, I'm sorry. If you're retyping a 1 GB volume and encrypted, you cannot put it in a 1 GB encrypted volume. Sorry. That's it. And we can go from there. Once we have that, where they can increase to just 1 GB more, we can look farther in the future into the optimized, just adding 1 MB or whatever. But yeah, probably that's the best approach right now, where we fix the bug. It's not great, but it works, and it's less likely to introduce new bugs because it's a smaller
It's
size.
explicit.
Yeah, I agree. I think that sounds the best.
And we already have the ability to track, sorry, Eric, we already have the ability to track quotas based upon our current scheme of 1 GB boundaries. And I think changing it to have the driver to, you know, kind of secretly, quote unquote, create, 1 GB plus 100 megs or 1 meg or whatever is going to be needed. How do you account for that in the quotas and being able to charge customers? Because as an operator, I want to be able to charge my customers for every, amount of storage that they're using because it's expensive for me,
Well, you could do it based on the volume type. If it's encrypted, you can charge them more because you know that it needs 1 MB more. But still, like you say, it's more work in it. Yeah.
I like the idea of doing something that's not going to give a lot more bugs. I think it's like I like the sound of that. But this seems
Brian, you're
reasonable.
asking so much.
It's software. You know there's going to be something wrong with it, but we can at least limit the scope of how bad it is. So Eric and Sophia, how does that sound?
I like it. Having a workaround will, give us something that can help people, and then if we want to do more, we can do more, like Gorka was saying. So I kind of like that approach.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah, me too. I think we need to add the documentation warming before working on those. But I don't know really if someone is using this feature.
Okay, and if we put this off for much longer, there may be like great strides in storage technology that will solve this problem on the back end. So who knows? Okay, great. All right, I'm going to move pretty quickly through the next couple of things. So actually, I should say, any last thoughts about this? So I encourage you to go back and add your thoughts if you do think of something. So do that. Okay. So quotas, as we know, they do some weird things to the database. Sometimes you get multiple rows for the same thing. And people have various scripts to go back and try to reset things. So we've known this is a pain point for a while, and I guess, well, my manager wanted us to discuss this, is what this comes down to. So it's a pain point, but I guess, is it big enough that anyone here would want to work on quotas. They're very interesting, and some people are very excited about this kind of thing, just like about interoperability. See, I introduced it the wrong way. So this is a real exciting area of work if somebody's interested in doing quotas. And Eric already has a patch, although, as I noted here,
Yes,
Orca's got a different approach you could take, noted on that patch also.
no, that patch doesn't really work.
Okay.
I wrote that one day when I was thinking I was real smart, and I'm totally wrong. But so, yeah. So the basic problem I think here, this is my usual assessment if you've heard this before of this whole thing. When you create and delete volumes and extend volumes, there's a whole set of tables aside from the volumes table that keeps track of how much space you're using, and it gets incremented and decremented. And there's a handful of race conditions that are kind of hard to identify and places that this goes wrong when errors happen. But the root kind of failure here is that it seems that if you have a sufficiently large deployment with enough activity creating and deleting and resizing volumes, eventually you'll end up with a quota usage table that says that you're using more gigabytes of space than you're actually using. So over the years, that's gotten a little better where people have gone in and patched up places in the code that just missed things, and a little bit of it's been solved that way. My argument is generally that we need to just get rid of this whole notion that we have a separate table where we account for how much space we're using, and just query the volumes table live every time we want to know how much stuff we have. Because then everything ends up being, you can synchronize everything if you do it right at the database layer, and you don't have to have all these concerns about, I made a volume, I better go write down that I made a volume over there. What if something happens between those two steps, and that kind of thing. So my theory is that we basically want to get rid of the quota usages table as we have it now and replace it with live queries on the volumes table, which I think this patch that's linked at the end of this was a recent proposal to do something very similar to that. I haven't read through the spec yet because I just saw it yesterday, but I think this is actually proposing doing something like this. And I don't think that's terribly hard to do conceptually. It's just that it's a whole lot of code to mess with, and nobody has volunteered to go do it yet.
But I guess, what are the performance impacts of doing that kind of thing?
So somebody tried to do something like this a few years ago, and they claimed that it had big performance impacts. I don't buy that there's problematic performance impacts, because if you have a volumes table in the database and we have the correct indexes, which we can add indexes if we need to, it should be trivial to just say count all the volumes that are owned by this guy. Like, that's, SQL databases are really good at doing that kind of thing. Somebody was working on this a few years ago and kind of got roadblocked, saying they were concerned about performance, things like that they ran into. I never really figured out why that was a big problem, because it doesn't, I don't see any reason to believe that would be a big problem if you did this right. I'm fairly sure that a not very big SQL database can count Cinder volumes. Because you can definitely count them a lot faster than you can create them on the back end. So how bad could it be? I mean, it's, I don't know why there would be a big performance concern, really.
Well, we also have to remember that for the accounting to be right, we need to do a transaction where we block all the volumes from that. So you're actually blocking all the other requests of that user. I agree with you, Eric. It shouldn't be a problem, but it's something to take into account when thinking that, oh, this is probably will not affect performance. We have to calculate that all other operations from the tenant for the volume table will be blocked for a bit.
Yeah, and Nova reworked their quota stuff a few years ago, and I don't know a ton about what they did, but I do know that they had a performance concern in how they were doing it, and they made some trade-off as part of that where they just said, well, we're going to let people some of the time run a little bit over quota, but not by a lot, and whatever kind of trade-off they made for performance resulted in that behavior, and they thought it was a good trade-off. But you know, I don't know. I'm not worried about the performance of this personally. I mean, I would love to see. I think the claim that we can't query the database and figure out how many gigabytes somebody has quickly would need a lot of evidence to show that that's a big problem.
Well, that seems reasonable. I mean, what other kind of quotas do we have right now?
Well, you got gigabytes, volume gigabytes, volume count. I think the same for snapshots and backups, maybe groups. There's not a ton of them.
So it's counts plus base.
Yeah. The volume gigabytes one seems to be the one that people have run into issues with. I don't know if that's just because that's the one they notice more. Maybe the other ones have problems and we just, nobody notices. I don't know. But the volume one seems to be the one that people file bugs about. And, we've been shipping OSP for a number of years at Red Hat, and we get a few bugs every year about this same exact thing. I mean, it's a continual thing that people do run into, which is why if you go search around online, there's all kind of tools that will go in and count what you have and adjust your database for you and that kind of stuff that people have developed to maintain their deployments.
I think we actually even have code in Cinder that goes and recalculate this thing in the database. If you remove the row, I think it goes and recalculates it when it goes to query.
So yeah, maybe. So one piece of this that I don't find very exciting, but that I should probably mention just for awareness is I think there were some recent discussions around adding a Cinder manage command that you could run that would count stuff and adjust things to patch up your database for you, only because it would be nice to have a standard way to fix that, assuming that we could deliver that way faster than we could actually fix this problem. I'm much more interested in just fixing the whole thing, but that may be an intermediate tool, basically taking, this script kind of stuff that a whole bunch of different organizations have developed and published, and at least standardizing one into Cinder for admins so they're not just stranded. There were some questions in here about the Keystone quotas and all that. I don't know. Some of that seems like an orthogonal thing to me.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the main thing is to just make sure that we could attach to it. But basically, the Keystone thing is the limits. So it just gives operators one service to go to set the limits. So basically, Nova provides like a list of what quotas it will recognize, and then operators can fill that out. And there's a default, or you can override it by defining it in Keystone. And then when you actually do your quotas, the difference is you have to go to Keystone to find out what the limit is to see if this user has hit it or not. So that's basically what's happening there. I guess I'm worried about the database performance. Like if you're doing, right, if you're an admin and you're like getting usages information for tenants, you're going to be, right, just hammering things. I guess there's a way around that if we had a.
If you have a properly defined index, the overhead that it takes to update that index probably is not going to be worse than polling and doing whatever we do now. I mean, all the same math has to happen somewhere. And, you know, if you design the indexes right, the database will just do it for you. So it's, I don't know.
One thing I remember is when we query a quota for any random project that doesn't exist, then it shows. That was also one issue, I guess.
Yeah. Can you say that again? Just, I didn't catch all of it, but I think I know what you're talking about.
So when we fire the quota usage command for any random tenant that doesn't exist, like Cinder database doesn't know that which all tenants exist. So when we fire a command, then it shows the defaults, which shows the quotas for that, but that tenant doesn't exist in the OpenStack deployment.
Yeah, there's a few usability things like that. One of the classic ones that came up a whole bunch of times in bug reports was people who would do a Cinder quota update, and they would give like a name of a tenant instead of an ID, and it would say sure, and it would write it in the database, and then it would never be used for anything because it wasn't formatted with the correct ID. So all the stuff we talked about so far was mostly around the accounting, race conditions, and problems that happen there. Yeah, there definitely are some usability things to work on with that stuff too. Some of which I think we have some ideas on. Some of them I'm not so sure. If I recall, there was a discussion for one of those Cinder client commands where we were talking about the idea of throwing warnings if it looked like you were trying to manipulate a quota for a tenant that didn't exist. But I don't know exactly what we want to do there.
And I think another part wasn't this on the quota that we needed to get a UUID, and instead people tend to give something else? Or was that something completely different?
Yeah, when you set the values, creating a quota, it only does anything if you've set them based on the project UUID, but you can type in anything and Cinder will take it and record it in its database. So we may want to just restrict that at the API level so that people can't pass in stuff that's not valid to that API.
Well, I think that's a place where the Keystone thing would be good because presumably they do that kind of thing there. So if you want to change the quotas for somebody, you would do it in the unified limits, I think, and not directly in Cinder. So we would be in charge of computing all the usage, but they'd be in charge of specifying, right? Because we would have to pass the tenant ID to find out what their limits were. So that problem might go away.
It might. I think what you end up doing in that case in Cinder is you would replace whatever the Cinder DB quota driver that we have with some other quota driver that knows how to talk to this service. I would assume that we would be supporting both of them for the foreseeable future, but I don't know.
Well, we could have a good one and a bad one, and then that would give people reason to switch.
I think really, I think if you plugged in this unified limits, whatever the service is called with that, I think it would just break in all the same ways the current one breaks right now, because I don't think that's where most of the problems actually are. But I don't know. So it's a service that's going to count limits. A while ago, somebody wanted a service that was going to count usage. Is that not the idea anymore? I don't know. I haven't followed that area.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that they decided that that was not a good idea. So, but the main, and I think the main thing for the unified limits was really just so that there's one place for operators to go to define all this stuff, instead of having different APIs in every service. But it's
Okay.
up to the services to actually do the usage kind of thing. And then, right, and then as far as determining your usage, that's going to depend on the project. But that probably makes sense because what you're interested in is probably kind of project specific. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the deployment. I mean, you know, one of the common lines that I seem to have in my head from a few years ago was that people use Cinder quotas more for things like keeping people from overloading their hardware, and some people don't use them at all for billing purposes, and they use, you know, the metrics monitoring stuff instead. So it's, I don't know, there's a lot of room there to design different schemes on how it works, I guess.
Okay, and then somebody posted something about the API return codes. Who was that?
It was me.
Okay.
Just
Ivan.
yes. So I just realized it today that we've got different API return codes, HTTP return codes for different quota actions. So sometimes we return 413 when quota exceed, and sometimes we return 500 error.
Well, 500 means Cinder broke, so
Yes,
that
absolutely.
shouldn't
But
really show up. But there was a debate about 413 versus 403, and I don't know where we are on that exactly.
in any case, if you want to change return code according to our guidelines, we have to add new microversion. And it doesn't sound like a good idea.
Do you have to have a new microversion to change a 413 error to a 403 error? Maybe, I don't know.
Yep. Makes sense.
I would love if the guidelines told us why 413 was this just a decision to try to make things uniform, or is there actually some behavioral reason that 413 is bad? The guidelines just say do not use 413.
Yeah, I don't know, because what's the over limit? Isn't there an over limit response? Is that 413?
Well, 413 is request entity too large, which normally I think means what you sent in that HTTP request.
Right. So
maybe that's the issue. I don't know.
I thought there was like an over limit response.
So
Yeah,
usually we don't turn 500 error, but I think in some corner case we could do it according to the code.
well, I mean, anytime that shows up, that's just a bug that needs to be fixed. That's not an API decision.
Yes, I agree with you, but I just checked our guidelines, the link. Our contributor API docs.
Okay, I guess the 403 thing is just for consistency across OpenStack projects. I guess that makes
Yes,
sense.
I
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think we need to change it right now to use this code because it could break a lot of existing users. Even if we agree to use new microversion for it, it just makes code more complicated without any real benefits. So I think we just need to check if we've got 500 error on quota limits and fix it as a bug fix without microversion bump.
I guess it depends on exactly what the problem is that's causing the 500, because I mean anybody who's detecting a 500 should expect that as an anomalous case, because it's a server-side error you can't deal with. So if we stop sending a 500 and instead send something correct for that error, right, they should be expecting a 403 or 413. Well, anyway, we can talk
Yeah,
about that later. Yeah. Okay.
We don't have code that intentionally sends a 500 anywhere, right? I think it only happens if you have a big exception where something just broke.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, like the other 500s for specific situations would not be bugs, right? Like a 501 or something. Okay. But yeah, we should. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts about quotas? Okay. These last two things, I'm just going to move them to Thursday because I'd like to have like a quick meeting with the core security team so I can get some sleep tonight. So thanks everyone for attending. We'll just end early today. If you're a driver maintainer or know a driver maintainer, please fill out the survey link at the top of this Etherpad. And if you have strong thoughts about drivers, even if you don't maintain them, feel free to fill that out also. Otherwise, we'll see everybody back here tomorrow. So I'm going to stop the recording. And then anyone on the core security team, you should have gotten an email from me giving you connection info for our discussion because it's non-public. If you don't, just ping me in IRC and I'll get it to you. Okay. Thanks everyone for attending. I think this was we had some good productive discussions and look forward to some more tomorrow. So I will stop recording now. Bye.